Hey everybody, thank you for sticking around. You made it to the home stretch. I'm Osmond Arnesto, and I am a UI designer and a front-end developer here at Sparkbox. But before that, I was making a career pivot from education to tech, and I was just learning how to design UIs and develop front ends, mostly through building small projects like the one you see on the screen here. It's a message board. While I was learning and building, it was easy to go back to the designer to clarify the intention of elements on a page, and then to work with a developer for feedback and implementation because they were the same person, the designer and the developer. I was just asking these questions myself. We usually are not going to have the luxury of the designer and the developer being the same person on a bigger team, much less a team that is working on a design system with so many moving parts. As Marani mentioned earlier, a design system has a bunch of different types of users with different end goals. And right now, we're going to focus on just some of the contributors. We'll take a designer who might be using a tool like Figma to create UIs, which is what our team uses and has the most experience in, and what our examples are going to be using today. We also have a developer who receives these designs and builds them with HTML, CSS, and maybe a JavaScript framework like React. We need these two roles to effectively communicate so that in the end, we can deliver the best experience to the user, whatever form that they may take. So you're probably asking, what problem are we trying to tackle today? Are we solving design to development handoff, a problem that's existed ever since Al Gore invented the internet? No. What we want to do today is enable design and development to better argue with each other. Because if we can do that, if we can have healthy conflict, if we can have meaningful discussions across disciplines, then we've answered or at least started to answer these three questions. How can we establish a shared language? What challenges are caused by tooling choices, and how can we address them? And do I really have to talk to other people? So, how do we start answering these questions? Well, let's start with being able to communicate at all. We can fight later, which is probably something that my parents wished that my siblings and I said to each other more often growing up. Um, let's take a look here. You're looking at dev mode, Figma's dev mode. Figma's added some features that can smooth the transition from design to development, including dev mode. Um, Figma features, though, aren't always going to map one-to-one to what's available to developers, and I'm going to use this example here to illustrate that. This is the code for your garden variety card component. Text in a container, a border. This one has a fancy radial gradient background. And this code that Figma generates in dev mode for the component notes a lot of things, a lot of properties you can see there. It also notes whether or not the component is using any Figma variables in the library, but more on those later. Now, in a perfect world, a lot of the work for the developer is done at this point. But usually this code won't be something that your developers can use right out of the box. Line one, display flex. That is not going to encapsulate all the behavior that we might want to have this component to have. Say if it's in a layout with other cards, and if we want the first card to always take up, say, half of the available space in a row, while the rest kind of just hug the length of their text. Now, this is something that developers can accomplish in the code using CSS Flexbox features to create responsive layouts. Figma right now can't perfectly replicate the Flexbox behavior, but that's fine. That's okay. Figma is not and should not be a Flexbox simulator. So how can we talk to each other without knowing how to do each other's jobs? I'm not saying you should learn how to do each other's jobs, but this is where it comes in handy to learn a little bit about how to do each other's jobs. Um, Here, and I'll talk about some things that we're trying in a design system that we're building for a current client. First change is a small one. We started using a naming convention called conventional commits that developers use to name their branches in the code to name our Figma branches. For example, here at the bottom, A feature branch, feat for short, means something new is being built, create card component. Above that, a fixed branch means a bug is being sorted out, and a docs branch means component documentation is either being added or modified. This is the equivalent of just using more inclusive language. It's a language that your developers are going to be used to seeing, and they'll know where to look if they have to review something that you've built. As an added bonus, having a naming convention for your branches is just more consistency for us on the design side. Another change was adopting number scaling that relates to the REM unit design system-wide. So if you don't know in code, a font face's font size isn't typically set to a specific pixel value. We usually use the REM unit. One REM is equivalent to what is effectively the default font size in the HTML, which is usually 16 pixels. So for example, this means 1.25 rem is equal to 16 times 1.25 is equal to, and I'm sorry for making you do math, 20 pixels. So to avoid having decimals like 1.25 in our variable names, we just move the decimal over 2 places. That's why you're seeing things in the hundreds here. So that 200 that you see, that's equal to 2 rem, 2 times 16, 32 pixels. Those are kind of some of the ways that design can learn about how development does their job. And let's talk about what development can learn from design. So we have a Figma component here that has a number of properties that can be either selected, like the state and the size there, some variants, or toggled, like focus and emphasized here, the Booleans. What's useful for a developer is knowing what these properties are going to mean for the code that they'll be writing. Is it a functionality that needs to be built in? Is it native behavior for the browser? Like the focus state, that's always available. Chrome, Firefox, Edge. And when should a Figma property map to something like a React prop? This is why consistent implementation is important. If something like a focus is a toggle or a Boolean on one component, but is included as a variant on another component, then you leave some room for confusion there. Okay, so say we've laid a foundation and we're able to start communicating with each other. Even then, the tools that we use every day can still get in the way of that. As I mentioned earlier, implementation and development is a lot of times radically different from the implementation in our design tool. We're going to use a single property called line height as an example here. So in development, a common approach to setting the line height of text is to use a unitless number that multiplies the element's font size property. The screenshot that you see on your screen now is Netflix's landing page. We're taking a look at the code. Take a look at that highlighted text. Over to the right is the code governing that. And on font size there, you can see that rem unit that we were talking about earlier. And below that, a couple of lines is line height using that 1.5. So that 1.5 means the value is equivalent to 1.5 times the font size, 1 rem, 16 pixels. The line height value property, can also accept pixel values, or like you can in Figma, percentage values. Percentage values aren't really recommended for use though in code because it can lead to unexpected behavior due to something called inheritance, which we don't have time to get into right now. But therein lies the rub, right? If you use the recommended unitless number, like 1.5, in the line height property on the Figma text element, that'll convert to a pixel value automatically, and nobody wants a 1.5 pixel line height for any size text. So going back to the design side, the inheritance issues that exist in code, those don't exist in Figma. We're able to set the line height of a text element at 150%, the equivalent of using the unitless 1.5, no problem at all. But what if we wanted to standardize this value with a Figma variable, systematize it? At the time of this talk, October 24th, 2024, CE or AD, depending on your preference, you can only apply a number variable like 16 to a text element's line height in Figma. Even if you can normally set the line height to 150%, like you can see here, if you wanted to use a variable instead, Your options are limited. So what should we do? Should we make variables in Figma that reflect what's going to be used in development, even if that means there are variables that designers won't be able to apply to anything? Do we create line height variables corresponding to each applicable font size, even if that means these variables aren't going to be used in development? So there are several options here. What we decided to do was leverage what already existed in Figma and use text styles. So we used the first option, where we made variables that reflected what are going to be used in development and to always kind of have available what options exist in the design system. Then we created text styles like what you see here with the appropriate percentage value equivalent to what the unitless number represents. So the approach here does have 2 points of improvement. As mentioned, this leads to a situation where Figma variables exist that aren't being used by designers. And second issue, we can't expect designers to know when to include a variable that they're not going to use. How would we know when to include a thing that we don't know we're going to use? So like Leah mentioned, it's for situations like this that communication and problem solving across disciplines is important. So maybe handoff isn't the best word for what should be happening between the design and the development teams. It's not a matter of passing the baton or it's somebody else's problem after you're done. Like most relationships, ideally, it's a two-way street, a game of tennis, if you want to continue the sports metaphor. And that's all the sports metaphors. I'm done. Besides, at this point, you've spent a lot of time creating a shared language with the development team. It's going to get rusty if you don't use it regularly. It's like Duolingo. You want to keep the streak going. And I just want to say, I get more notifications from that owl than I do from my whole family in a month. But it works. All the constant reminders. I still have a very elementary grasp of Spanish, but I mean, it hasn't gotten worse since high school. My point is that there's not going to be an owl coming out of the butt of another owl to remind you to collaborate with your developers. You have to take some initiative. But I have been talking today, assuming that both design and development are internal teams. In case they're not, it's always good to have some async options in your back pocket, which is true even if everyone is in-house. After all, you can't have infinite hours in the day to just pair with each other. So remember that developers are users of our systems, our designs. If you stopped existing once your designs went out the door, what does your user need in order to consume your work? And that might mean a certain level of documentation. What does the user need to know about the intended behavior of components? This comes with its own can of worms, a lot of questions that you have to ask yourself, like where do you put that documentation? In the Figma file? When should component functionality be conveyed through text, through documentation? And when should it be demonstrated by component properties? And who's in charge of updating that information? Another consideration is being clear about what's being changed between iterations, different passes at a component. If you have tried out Figma's history function, you know that it's not perfect for pointing out what's different as you go back and forth between history versions. So something that our team has tried is implementing a changelog that you can see here, which describes the relevant component that was worked on, who worked on it, and any changes that were made. So to wrap things up, how are we going to communicate better with the development team to get the best experience we can for the user of the design system? Well, we're going to have to get everybody on the same page and using the same vocabulary. We have to find out how we can use our tools to reinforce that shared language. And we're just going to have to keep doing it. Thank you for your time.